So the purpose of today's talk is to look at the different ways in which lawyers might work to defend religious liberty or work in support of religious institutions that are something other than maybe something we see a lot, which is the work of a religious liberty law firm, a place like Alliance Defending Freedom or the Becket Fund, or religious liberty clinics like our own here at Notre Dame. That work is obviously important, but it's far from the only type of work that lawyers can do to defend religious freedom or to work in service of religious institutions. So we'll hear today from a number of folks who've been successful and carved out careers doing this in a lot of different roles in the law. So we'll hear first from Jennie Bradley Lichter, who's to my right. She is the Deputy General Counsel at Catholic University of America and a Senior Legal Fellow at the Religious Freedom Institute. Previously, Jennie served in the White House as a Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Director for on the White House Domestic Policy Council, where she supervised rulemaking and policy efforts, including efforts across the federal government to protect religious liberty, to encourage faith-based partnerships, and to defend the dignity of life. Prior to that, Jennie was in the Office of Legal Policy at DOJ, where she worked on policy issues and judicial confirmation efforts. She's also served as an in-house counsel for the Archdiocese of Washington and as associate at Jones Day. Before all of that, she clerked for Judge David Sintel on the D.C. Circuit and Judge Steve Colleton on the 8th Circuit. She graduated from Notre Dame. She holds an MPhil from Cambridge, and she graduated from Harvard Law School. I guess we shouldn't talk about the Bradley family. One in a long line of distinguished Bradleys here, of course, at our law school. So we're happy to have Jennie back. After Jennie, we'll hear from Genevieve Kelly, who's here to my left. She is the Chief of Enforcement and Case Management within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights. So there, she manages a docket of thousands of civil rights complaints, which are linked primarily to claims of religious discrimination. Prior to joining HHS, Genevieve spent 7 years as an attorney in the DOJ's the DOJ Civil Division, where she was lead counsel on a number of trials and appeals. Her cases have been covered from the Washington Post to the LA Times, and she's received the Civil Division's John W. Douglas Award for pro bono advocacy on behalf of students with disabilities. She attended the University of Virginia and George Mason Law School, but I confirmed at lunch she also has deep family ties to Notre Dame, so she is welcome here as well. Next to Genevieve, we'll hear from Michael McGinley. He is a partner at Dechert LLP in Philadelphia with a practice that focuses on high-stakes litigation, especially appellate and complex commercial matters. He's litigated a wide range of issues, including federal jurisdiction, sovereign immunity, Chevron deference, constitutional rights, and more, at all levels of the federal judiciary and in state courts and in agencies across the country. He also keeps an active pro bono practice where, among other things, he litigates major cases in defense of religious freedom, and including working with our own Religious Liberty Clinic on a number of briefs we've filed before the Supreme Court in cases to defend religious freedom. Before Dechert, Michael served as an associate counsel and special assistant to the president in the White House counsel's office, where he primarily reviewed major legislative and administrative actions, and he worked in support of the confirmation of judicial nominees, including Justice Gorsuch. Before that, he clerked for Justice Alito and then Judge Gorsuch on the 10th Circuit, and he attended Notre Dame undergrad and Harvard Law School. And finally, Brendan Wilson, who many of you may know. He's a partner here at Faegre, Drinker, Biddle, and Reath, where he serves as a member of the firm's corporate and tax-exempt organizations practice groups. In that role, Brendan counsels churches, charities, private foundations, and associations on tax and corporate law matters. He is also an adjunct professor here at the law school within the Religious Liberty Initiative, where he teaches a religious organizations lab class where he leads students in advising religious institutions on a number of transactional matters, including things like tax and corporate law. Brendan grew up in Canada, attended the University of Guelph. Did I get that right? Guelph? And Notre Dame Law School. He also has an LLM from Georgetown. So without further ado, we'll begin with Jennie.
Thank you. I actually might go ahead and stand up only because I'm not confident that you can see me when I'm sitting here. So yeah, I don't think I'm tall enough to be visible if I'm sitting down. So, all right, so I'll hop up here. Okay, I'm really happy to be here, in Notre Dame Law School, which is essentially where I grew up, as John referenced. My dad's been teaching here for 30 years. Take all his classes. He's great, right over here. Professor Bradley, raise your hand. There we go. Okay, great. Shout out to the Bradley family. All right, so my career has essentially been a microcosm of this panel. I've done religious liberty work in several different settings, and I'm going to try and quickly touch on on each of those settings in a way that I hope is helpful to you and offer just some takeaways as you think about your own career doing religious liberty work. So the sort of prologue to the story is between my clerkships and going to Jones Day, I happened to meet at a fundraiser the newly minted General Counsel of the Cristo Rey Network, which is a network of Catholic high schools. And I kind of spilled my guts to him a little bit. I was feeling a little bit guilty about having decided to go back to my firm, even though I knew it was the right thing to do. I needed to pay down my massive law school debt, among other things. And but I was thinking of it sort of as like a diversion from my true vocation, right? Which I think is something public service-oriented law students and young lawyers tend to think about big law. So Mike and Brendan will probably talk about that a little bit, maybe that dynamic. But anyway, so I told this GC, I just finished clerking, I'm gonna come to Jones Day. But don't worry, like I'm really committed to doing religious liberty and religious institutions work. This is just gonna be for a little while. I really wanna do something, work in a shop like yours. And the piece of advice he gave me was really formative, although initially kind of jarring. He said, you would frankly be no use to me right now. I couldn't hire you right now even if I wanted to. Go to your law firm, learn how to be a really good lawyer, learn the craft of lawyering, and then come back to a place like my shop, and you'll be ready to really make a contribution. And I understand now that I've been in-house at 2 different religious organizations what he meant. Religious GC offices, religious nonprofit GC offices tend to be really small. They kind of operate on a shoestring budget, and they require the lawyers who work in these settings have to be really independent. There is no capacity to train up young lawyers who are kind of just getting their feet under them. In my office now at Catholic University, we wouldn't hire a very young lawyer. We just couldn't. Again, that person would be no use to us. Whereas at a law firm, right, training is baked into the model. There's the infrastructure for it. It's sort of part of the point. So my first piece of advice to you is if you, like me, are public service oriented and you want to work in religious institutions, but you find that your path takes you into a law firm for a time, don't rue that day. Really try and embrace it and learn everything you can, because that's going to make you even more valuable when the time is right for you to leave the firm and go into a religious institution. So I was an appellate associate at Jones Day for about 2.5 years. I worked with Mike there for a time, and I did learn a lot there. The absolute highlight of my time in big law was launched on a Friday afternoon, kind of out of nowhere, in February of 2012, when I got an email from a partner in the Chicago office of Jones Day who I barely knew, a wonderful graduate of this law school who's since passed away. But he sent me an email that said, hey, are you free to jump on a call at 5 o'clock today? It's time to help the bishops. And I was so excited, I didn't know what he had in mind. But it turned out that was the beginning of the contraceptive mandate litigation, which many of you maybe don't remember because it started over 10 years ago now, but the Obama administration's implementation of the Affordable Care Act involved, among other things, a mandate that insurance plans provide contraceptive coverage. At the time, in its initial version, that applied to religious organizations just like everyone else, right? This was a big problem for lots of Catholic entities, including dioceses, and a lot of other religious organizations as well. So after that February Friday afternoon, I spent the weekend working with another Notre Dame Law School alum, actually, drafting model complaints on behalf of clients we didn't technically have signed up yet, but we knew that this was going to be really important. And I spent almost all my time on it for the next few months. On a day in May in 2012, Jones Day filed, I think it was 17 different complaints on behalf of dozens and dozens of Catholic entities. The Becket Fund and others were doing the same thing at the time. We, Jones Day, represented Notre Dame in that litigation, as well as 2 places I went on to work, the Archdiocese of Washington and Catholic University. And it was a really important and really meaningful and fulfilling case. So I think the takeaway from that episode is just the importance of your network and of making sure that people know of your interest in and commitment to this issue set, right? Brian Murray from Jones Day Chicago reached out to me, even though we didn't really have a relationship, because he knew I had gone to Notre Dame, and he had heard through the grapevine that I was interested in sort of religious institutions work. And even more broadly, the Notre Dame network was the engine of that case at our law firm. We had 7 or 8 offices involved, and the default was essentially, if you when in doubt, just find a domer. And there's lots of them at Jones Day. Find a Notre Dame associate, they'll be helpful on this case, they'll care about it. So stay close to your network, especially the Notre Dame network, and just kind of get the word out that you want to do this work. So as I mentioned, in the course of that litigation, I met a bunch of GCs of Catholic institutions. That was really helpful for me too, particularly because it had never crossed my mind that dioceses in particular had general counsels, right? So hospitals do, schools sometimes do, or school systems, charitable entities, but it turns out dioceses, or many of them, also have GCs. I got to know the GC at the Archdiocese of Washington, where I was living at the time, still do live in the Archdiocese, and told her, I'd love to do this kind of work eventually. And then as a result, when she had an opening in her office, she reached out to me and asked me to move in-house there. The timing was really providential because I just had my first baby. So it worked out perfectly for me and for my family, and I did move over to the Archdiocese, and I stayed there for about 3.5 years. So I'm going to tell you a little bit. I think I'm the only one here who's had in-house experience, so I'm going to tell you kind of in detail what that looks like. But first, I just want to offer, I think that religious institutions' in-house work is really important. It's a really important calling in the church, right? The Lord calls each member of his body differently, and some people are called to be full-time evangelists, right? To be teachers or ministers, or to be in religious life. I am not called to full-time evangelization, and you all probably aren't either. That's why you're sitting in this room. But you can contribute to the church's mission of evangelization by sort of helping to keep its temporal affairs in good order, right? That's really important. And a lot of church entities have struggled over the years with not having really sophisticated kind of business side operations, you could say, which includes the legal side. It's super important for the institutional health of all of our Catholic entities, and it's a way that we can support the frontline evangelists. So what is religious nonprofit work actually like? It is very different from being an appellate associate at a big law firm. As a brief writer, you have the luxury of sort of hunkering down with Westlaw, right, for hours or even days at a time, and working on the same project or the same handful of projects. At ADW, I would occasionally kind of, just for fun, count up the number of different matters I had handled in the course of a day. It was usually somewhere between 12 and 17. And this is not just 12 to 17 different matters, it's different types of matters, right? So it's pivoting from HR to employee benefits to a disability accommodations issue in a school to trying to handle the probate of some sort of complicated inheritance that had been left to the diocese. I did religious immigration and contract review and tax questions and a lot of public policy analysis and engagement and all kinds of random one-off questions and issues. So what kind of qualities do you need to have to succeed in that sort of environment? You have to be a super agile lawyer, again, in a way that I think being a junior associate, at least at a law firm, doesn't necessarily require of you. You have to be able to pivot really fast between these matters and issues and clients and keep your head in the game. So you wrap something up, you take a deep breath, you go on to the next thing. You also have to be really confident, which can be hard, I think, when you're a junior or a mid-level lawyer. But when you're in-house, you're required to give actionable legal advice to people who are really relying on your counsel. You don't always have the luxury of time to deep dive an issue, and you don't have other associates to help you with the research. So the training wheels really came off for me right away as soon as I got to the Archdiocese. At law firms, associates, especially younger ones, typically filter their advice to clients through a more senior lawyer. Again, in-house, because of the resource constraints, you can't really do that. So right away, I'm fielding phone calls from pastors and principals and diocesan administrators presenting legal questions that they expected me to answer. And I remember at first saying to the general counsel, such and such, Father so-and-so called me from this urban parish. He's having a problem with this man who keeps kind of yelling at people in the church. And he called me and said, what should he do? And I was kind of like, how would I know what he should do? Sort of asking her to tell me, the general counsel. She was like, well, you're his lawyer, so you need to figure it out. He's like relying on you to give him an answer. And the answer ended, we ended up getting a restraining order, but that just wasn't, I had never done anything like that before, right? Like, how do you get a restraining order in Washington? Like, how would I know that, Well, you figure it out. So it's very empowering, but yes, kind of jarring at first. You need really good judgment because you need to be able to discern quickly where you do need to linger, right? There are some questions where you need to take the time and the care to make sure that you're really right. But a lot of times, honestly, a quick and dirty solution is going to do the trick, right? Your clients who are your colleagues are checking in with you for counsel or doing a gut check, and you need to be able to tell them pretty quickly, like, yes, proceed, right? You don't want to hold up the business operations of your institution So you're constantly running a mental risk analysis. Like, what are the consequences if I get this wrong? And sometimes we probably are wrong, my colleagues and I, but sometimes it doesn't matter too much, because again, you're sort of trying to mitigate as much risk as you can. But you can't do it all when you're in a 3-person legal office advising a university. That's hard to get comfortable with for lawyers, but it's an important thing to be able to kind of exercise that judgment about. And I think last quality that's really important is, I don't know if you'd call it sort of code switching or translation skills, but unlike in a law firm, when, again, especially when you're relatively junior, you're really only talking to other lawyers. I work with non-lawyers all day long, right? And so I need to be able to give them legal advice in a way that's clear and understandable and actionable. They don't know legal terminology. They hate acronyms. They will say to me, like, this sounds too lawyery. Like, I don't understand what you're talking about. So I'm constantly still learning how to effectively convey nuanced and accurate legal advice in a way that doesn't rely on the way that lawyers talk to each other, right? That's not too heavy on legal terms, that doesn't assume any sort of baseline knowledge that the development team or the student affairs team or the HR people don't necessarily have. At the Archdiocese specifically, so I was there from early 2014 to the end of 2017. This was in some ways a disheartening time to be working at a religious institution. The government, the mandate litigation was still ongoing. There were all sorts of other kind of problems coming our way in the form of government regulation. The Archdiocese of Washington straddles Maryland, parts of Maryland and DC, which are both pretty unfriendly jurisdictions to religious institutions. Then in the middle of all this, the Obergefell case was argued, right? And the US Solicitor General dropped a little bit of a bomb in that argument. Justice Alito asked him whether an institution, in the government's view, the federal government's view, after Obergefell, would a religious institution that opposed same-sex marriage be in danger of losing its tax-exempt status? And the Solicitor General said, essentially, yes, in so many words. He said to the court, it's certainly going to be an issue. I don't deny that. It is going to be an issue. And that possibly inadvertently transparent statement from the United States government was very chilling to hear. As a religious institutions lawyer, it caused a huge stir in diocesan attorney world. And beyond that, for me, it caused me to really reflect on how to think about the mission of the church and church institutions in our increasingly hostile milieu, right? And what is my role as a lawyer in this milieu? So something I thought about a lot at the time and have thought about a lot since that I'll offer to you for reflection is, I think it's important to remember that Jesus never promised tax-exempt status, right? He promised that he'd be with us always until the end of the age, and he promised to send the Holy Spirit to guide the church. And he bestowed a mission of evangelization that is not contingent on how individual believers or religious institutions are treated by the civil and political authorities at any point in time, right? A bad government that takes away, benefits that the church has had for many decades is not an excuse to sort of stop doing your utmost to carry out the mission of evangelizing the world. That's a hard lesson to remember, but it is really important because offering legal advice to religious institutions in our current milieu is very sensitive because you're talking to executives, whether they're bishops or university presidents or what have you, who are well aware that anything they do to uphold a robust religious identity is going to cause immediate negative backlash on them and on their institutions, right? Whether that's a communications problem, financial repercussions, right, if donors pull their money, legal problems. Losing tax-exempt status is like the boogeyman. It would be a huge blow for any religious institution, and it would be existential for some to lose that benefit. So many nonprofit leaders and lots of lawyers avoid, prioritize avoiding inviting consequences like that, or even lesser ones, but avoiding inviting negative consequences because they think they need to do that in order to maintain the sort of longevity of the institution or whatever. We as counselors have to keep the big picture in mind. We are trained to be risk averse as lawyers, but when we're lawyering for a church entity, right, what our goal should be bigger and more important than just keeping our clients sort of out of the government crosshairs. I think we need to, what we can bring to the table as well-trained and faithful and also strategically savvy lawyers who know and love the church is our kind of crucial legal advice that's tempered by a knowledge of the bigger picture. That's a very important voice to be able to have at the table for our decision makers as they navigate the current milieu. So fast forward to the fall of 2017, I had by that point declined about half a dozen different jobs in the Trump administration. I liked my job at ADW and it was working well for my family, so I had a pretty high bar for leaving it. But I did eventually take a job at the Office of Legal Policy at the DOJ, which is where I had actually interned as a 1L. Felt like the right next step for me, in part because I could keep doing religious liberty work there. At the department, my religious liberty work took the form of reviewing proposed regulations from across the government. I also reviewed briefs that touched on RFRA and other religious liberty issues. I proposed and ultimately launched a religious liberty task force at the DOJ that was meant to be sort of a prioritization and coordination body within the department that AG Sessions approved and AG Barr ultimately embraced as well. I left the department in the spring of 2019 and then served the rest of the administration in the White House. As John mentioned, I was the deputy director of the Domestic Policy Council. That is, DPC is a big team with a huge portfolio. So if you think of like all the things that the government handles, the National Economic Council handles sort of core economics and tax and finance issues, right? And then you have the National Security Council who's handling Homeland and National Security and Foreign Relations. DPC does everything else. So it's most of the federal government, I would say. The other policy councils might disagree with me, but kind of sit with DPC. So my team and I were handling issues from Education Department, Labor, HUD, HHS, DOJ, Veterans Affairs. I handled Indian Affairs coming out of Interior. I worked on regulatory reform, but most importantly, I got to lead religious liberty efforts across the federal government. What does that look like? So this was a policy role, right? Not a legal role. Mike was a lawyer in the White House. I was on the policy team. I think I was probably a difficult client because the lawyers would try and give me advice or instructions and I would tell them they were wrong and I wanted them to try again. Like, oh my gosh. That only happened a few times. So as policymakers in the White House, we have a number of tools at our disposal as we direct the activities of the federal government. We have the bully pulpit of the White House, which, and that's specifically the president's voice, and our President Trump in particular had a very large bully pulpit. He was comfortable using that tool. We had rulemaking authority, not on our own, right? The White House doesn't regulate, but we work closely with the agencies who do. We sort of advise and direct them on key rules. The government more broadly has litigation and enforcement opportunities. The White House is careful about how it engages in those things, but we are involved on some issues. And then every agency has tons of money to distribute, right? That's one of the kind of key powers of the executive branch. You can distribute money in all sorts of interesting ways with all sorts of interesting conditions attached, subject to the lawyer's advice. So my goal in my role at DPC was to utilize all of those tools to the max to advance key parts of our agenda, and in particular, the rights of people of faith and religious communities. There's a lot of interesting and creative ways to do that. You do have a big bully pulpit, obviously. It's really challenging work, but it was super satisfying and just unmatched in being able to affect concrete change. But if you look behind the curtain, in any, I think, probably political setting, in any presidential administration for sure, there isn't internal unanimity, especially on things that are complex and sensitive, like religious freedom, right? Which sometimes intersects with other rights and can get very complicated and uncomfortable for people who aren't used to working in this space. So one important thing that I learned from this season in my life that I think is applicable in a lot of professional settings is you can buy yourself sort of a lot of leeway, like a lot of running room, to kind of come in hot as a maximalist for religious liberty if you behave as an unimpeachable professional on other issues, right? So you have to work hard and deliver results for your clients, whoever they are, whether it's the President of the United States or the President of your university or your HR people or whoever, your colleagues in your law firm. Be a good colleague and a trusted partner. Be really generous with your time. Be a cheerful warrior. Support other people's priorities whenever you can. Then when you're sitting in a meeting pitching a policy or litigation or a pro bono project at your firm that you want permission to take on, then you get a little more grace. If you're talking to people, as you often will be, who are less excited than you are, you might say, about religious liberty, they'll be much more willing to hear you out and to ultimately sort of get on board with what you want to do if they like you, frankly, and if they trust you, and if they know that you're a hard worker and that you've kind of brought value to the table on a lot of other issues as well. After I left the White House, just briefly, I came to Catholic University. The president of the university at the time, who recruited me to join his legal team, was a former professor at this law school, John Garvey. who taught here, I think in the 90s, if I'm remembering correctly. His pitch was, come here and be a part of steering this faithfully, robustly Catholic institution. And I thought I might be done practicing law, honestly, after I had such a blast being on the policy side in the White House. But I couldn't pass up John's invitation, so I went to Catholic. I'm the deputy GC there. The work is similar to at ADW. It's another small, woefully understaffed legal office where we all carry really big portfolios. Requires the same agility, good judgment, ability to communicate with non-lawyers. I handle a bunch of issues. Again, I have student affairs, which is particular to higher ed, but includes Title IX, student disciplinary stuff, a lot of other things like that. And then among other things, of course, I handle our religious identity issues. I'm also currently chairing at Catholic a broad-ranging campus-wide audit aimed at determining how we can better serve the pregnant and parenting students and staff and faculty in our community at Catholic University, and we're planning to announce our project a month from today, so stay tuned on that. The final takeaway I'll offer, we're here to talk about our careers in religious liberty, but I think for all of us, I know for all of the people on this panel, the backdrop of all of what we're talking about is our families, right? And our commitment to our families and our families' lives. All of us, I gather, just from our conversation at lunch, have made career decisions informed by, and in some cases really because of, our families' needs as they've changed over time. And that's really important to keep in mind, I think, when you hear this kind of conversation in this kind of panel. I try and stay in a constant state of discernment alongside my husband, who's also a lawyer, about how his work and my work are impacting our family's life, and of when we need to make a change. We've supported each other as our careers have ebbed and flowed. He has at times been very, very busy and traveled a lot, and I adjusted accordingly. I was actually part-time at the Archdiocese. That was a very hard-fought battle, I'm sorry to say, but ultimately I was able to be part-time when I was at ADW, and my family needed that. And he believed firmly in my vocation to lead policy efforts in the White House, and he stepped up and learned a lot about things like, he said to me at the beginning of the school year one year, I don't know, our kids have been in school for years and we've never had to do paperwork. Like what's going on this year that all of a sudden schools are requiring paperwork, It's like, no, you just never see any of this stuff, right? So anyway, so we work really hard to stay attuned to our kids' needs and ramp up or ramp down accordingly. I attempted to quit my job in the White House a month or two into COVID, which was a really unsettling time for everyone, right? Especially for children who suddenly couldn't go to school. My plan, it didn't quite work out. Some senior folks asked me to stay. But I explained, no, I really want to be able to spend this summer with my kids. They've had a pretty rough spring. I ultimately was offered 8 weeks off, which I think is pretty unheard of in the White House. But I did that and then returned to help lead DPC through the final few months. And then kind of, again, Brian and I revisited discerning what the next step looked like for both of us. So I just really encourage you to view your professional life similarly as seasons that ebb and flow, and just make sure to stay attuned to your personal vocation, right, as well as your professional vocation. And if your heart's desire is to work in this space, this religious liberty space, you'll find a way to do it, or it will find you. I think, again, that's kind of the final takeaway of my career path, and everybody else is here too. It's very satisfying and very meaningful work, so that is it. I warned John ahead of time that since I've essentially had 4 careers in religious liberty, I was going to talk a little bit longer than the allotted time per person. But I will yield now to my colleagues. I'm happy to answer any questions later. Thanks.
I'm Genevieve Kelly. I've had a very short career so far in religious liberty. I've spent the last about 18 months at the Department of Health and Human Services, which was on the other side of the V on some of the litigation that Jennie was talking about. I'm in the Office of Civil Rights, which does enforcement and rulemaking on a number of issues, including issues affecting religious freedom, religious discrimination, the conscience statutes, which protect healthcare providers from having to participate in certain procedures that violate their religious beliefs or conscience. I started my law career after working and helping build one of the Cristo Rey schools that Jennie was referring to, the one in DC. And in that process, we were serving kids with huge economic disadvantages. It was a very, very messy work. And somehow I was enjoying things that were really intellectually challenging, in some cases emotionally challenging, to do on behalf of people who didn't have the tools to advocate for themselves, or really kind of, perhaps do some of that intellectual heavy lifting. That was what I loved about the job. So it led me to law school. Coincidentally, one of my coworkers at the school came here for law school right after as well. And from law school, I went to the Department of Justice. Jennie was mentioning how jobs will find you. I had 2 babies in law school and was just kind of needed health insurance and was thrilled to get the DOJ offer and a steady paycheck with good health insurance. It was a wonderful place to work. I highly encourage it for any of you. You will hear about great law firm experience. That was a great law firm experience for me, learning the practice and the craft of litigation, which I never thought I'd want to do when I was sitting in your shoes, going to career panels. I thought I'd never litigate. Those are people who like to argue and get in fights. No, it's for people who really want to help teach the court what the law says. So those of you who are inclined toward sort of pro bono work and service, which is why you're probably here today, don't discount the litigation. It actually, you can do great work through that. DOJ, I was doing immigration cases. The immigration, I don't know if you ever took immigration law. I never did in law school. The code is very thick and horrible to read. It's a nightmare. And I liked it. I liked that about it. It was confusing and thorny and intellectually challenging. And you're doing it on behalf of people who, sometimes don't even speak English or don't even have any clue what these rules would be. There's something satisfying about that. So I did that for a long time until I was able to get kind of all the experience that I felt like DOJ could offer me that I wanted, and then was ready to have no court deadlines and a little more freedom as a mom to spend more time with my children. And I had an offer at HHS. So HHS gives out a lot of money, more money than anyone else in the federal government. The Office of Civil Rights polices the use of the money. So if you accept the money, it's contingent on certain non-discrimination provisions and other things. So the office does enforcement and rulemaking. I'm the chief of enforcement and case management. But one thing about working for the government is that if you're hardworking and you're pretty good at reading the law, you get a bigger portfolio, than what necessarily your job description provides. That is consistent across the federal government. In any place I've heard about. So for those of you interested in these topics, if you're in the government, you'll be amazed at the opportunities that arise. Things will just land, like we need someone to help with this. And it could be in an office that you think, gee, the office I'm in would never touch on a religious issue. It very well may, And then you have opportunities to kind of jump on things and volunteer and expand your expertise. So one great thing about the government, and I am a career attorney. Jennie talked about being a political appointee. So political appointees are, hired or let go at the discretion of the president or, someone delegated that authority. Their job is to create the policy. The career's job is to kind of be the steady, bureaucracy that develops over time, doesn't come and go with each wave of administration, but develops some long-term subject matter expertise so you can really guide the political appointees who come for a short time usually and offer a level of expertise that they just won't have by virtue of not having been in that position for very long. I love that work, and even though it would also be fun to make the policy, it's amazing how much authority you can have as an advisor. And you are working with the politicals closely, developing friendships. No matter what administration is there, you're finding people of integrity. You're finding who are the good people to work with, who will trust me to offer my opinion. And you're sort of reproving yourself again every time there's a new crowd coming in. But you are really positioned well to give good counsel that is very often, advice that is taken. And there's something really satisfying about that work because it is so intellectually honest. And you really get to pursue the truth for the sake of the truth. And at DOJ, my first day on the job, every new attorney has to take an oath to serve the Constitution, to uphold the Constitution. And everyone takes that very, very seriously. And there's a memo that gets circulated around the Department of Justice for new attorneys that's about how your client is not the president, it's not the Department of Justice, it's not the agency you're defending in the lawsuit, it's the United States. When I got to HHS, the same thing happened. I took an oath to the Constitution and was told that my client is the United States. So it gives you a freedom where you can really speak up. You're bound to speak up if you think something's wrong or something's unlawful that a political is considering. It's really a great environment. And for those of you who are inclined towards nonprofit work or public service, that's really what you're doing. It really is service. That's in my experience. So I highly recommend it. I'll mention a few things for those interested in career government work. Number one, getting hired is a nightmare. Even if someone knows you, wants to hire you, has basically said, I'm posting this position, it matches the resume I've seen you have, it's still a nightmare. And you have to go through this USA Jobs beast. And there will often be very much non-lawyers, people who have no idea what the job really entails, working in HR, screening the first round of resumes. And they might have a hard time understanding why your federal clerkship counts as legal work or valuable law experience. You have to really spell it out for them. So advice number one, make your resume really just, exactly model, what they're listing, using the same phrases and things so that no one could possibly miss, that they check it off, that you meet all those criteria. That's really the hardest part, getting through that first round. Second, because there are these great opportunities to work on different things that may surprise you, the amount of issues we could work on in DOJ with the immigration was really interesting. Things that really you don't think of as immigration related, criminal due process stuff, RFRA stuff, all coming in. Because of that, just kind of trust that once you get in, opportunities are going to come. And people are going to find the smart people of integrity and value you. You're going to be found quickly. You're going to be valued quickly. So just have faith in that happening. And just kind of getting in is the tricky part. Your portfolio will expand beyond imagination once you're in there and you prove yourself. And then the other recommendation is just to keep surrounding yourselves by people who think differently. It's interesting to see how in our information cocoons that we're developing lately as a society, people are using the same words in such different ways, right? And then we're kind of having these debates over Twitter, and we're actually speaking different languages. And not everyone is realizing that it's actually a completely different language. And you have to learn the language of everyone else. Learn it as a language, not just knowing that it's probably different, but read enough that you actually see how those words are being used differently. And you'll be able to then find, nuance. You'll find solutions in the law. You'll understand the other side's motive. And the last sort of bit for some of you, if you're like me, I didn't want to be a litigator. I hated moot court. I thought it was for people who are really good at posturing. It was a fake set of facts, who could kind of posture the most won. And I was so relieved when I got into court that it was nothing like moot court. It was these are real issues, It's actually about the judge actually read the briefs, not like the moot court judge. And so I want to encourage you that one thing I learned doing in that process was one of the most valuable qualities of a litigator or a lawyer is empathy. And it amazed me how many times I'd be in court against someone who thought they were a super big shot, partner of a big firm, and didn't care enough to really learn why the other person on the other side of the V had a different position. Like, what was the real issue for them? And so they would get buried. You know, they posture really nice, but they didn't have a chance, really. And so those of you who are public service minded, I just want to give you that encouragement that it's a really valuable legal skill. It just helps you understand things and spot issues better when you can put yourself in someone else's shoes. So don't get intimidated by the people who, you know, the sharks out there who maybe aren't exemplifying that. You'll beat them when you have a chance. So that's all. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to answering questions.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mike McGinley. As John said, I'm a partner at Dechert LLP in Philadelphia. I think I'm here to convince you that you can actually do religious liberty work at a law firm. And it turns out I'm relatively well qualified to talk about it because I've been at 4 law firms. And I promise I wasn't fired from any of them. As Jennie mentioned, that she and I started at Jones Day together, which is, you know, I think familiar to many people here at this law school because there's so many Notre Dame graduates that are at Jones Day or have been at Jones Day. It's kind of your classic mega firm. It's a huge worldwide law firm, excellent law firm. Really is probably one of the few big law firms that I think legitimately can say that they do a lot of religious liberty work and do it as party litigation, where they are actually representing, in the case of the contraceptive mandate cases, they were representing people who sued, the diocese and different entities that sued to try to enjoin the mandate. After that, I was at a small firm called Bancroft that I used to say no longer exists. Technically, it no longer exists. It was run by Paul Clement and a gentleman named Viet Din, who's now at Fox. We all left to go to Kirkland in 2016. Since Paul has created a new law firm called Clement and Murphy that I think is largely mimics what Bancroft was like. And at Bancroft, we were a small firm. We focused mostly on appellate and Supreme Court work. And we did a fair amount of paid work for parties in religious liberty litigation. Just one example that I had the great honor of working on was the Hobby Lobby case. We represented Hobby Lobby at the Supreme Court along with the Beckett Fund. And Bancroft in some ways was unique. Not technically unique because there's probably 4 or 5 other law firms in Washington predominantly that are able to do that kind of work because they don't have the sort of conflicts that will often prevent lawyers at big law firms from doing some of it. And also they sort of have the whole point of a small shop like that is that you have the freedom to take on the cases that you want to take on, and you don't have the financial pressures that larger law firms tend to have. I was briefly at Kirkland before I went into government. I don't have a whole lot to say about that because it was 3 months. And I've been at Dechert for over 4 years now. So it's the longest job I've ever held, and I don't plan on leaving anytime soon. And I have been able to carve out a good amount of religious liberty work at Dechert. I will say, for me, whether by happenstance or by the nature of the firm, most of it has been through amicus briefs, and mostly Supreme Court amicus briefs. I have the great honor to work with John and others at the clinic and Francesca on a number of Supreme Court amicus briefs in religious liberty cases. I think we did 3 or 4 just last year, which was a banner year at the Supreme Court. And then I also have done, not just with the clinic, but with other clients in other cases. So, I will say it's possible, and not only is it possible, but I find it spiritually enriching, as even in a private law firm where a lot of your time is spent working on cases for paying clients. In a big firm like Dechert, it's often corporations or hedge funds or sort of faceless entities, so to speak. But it's a way that you can give back to the profession. Jennie, I think, mentioned a few times the concept of vocation, which is something that's always been a term that I associate with my career as a lawyer in all the different facets of my career and all the different jobs I've had. I think, one of the great blessings of being a lawyer is that you're trusted with other people's problems. like my kids will ask me, what does a lawyer do? And I tell them I solve people's problems, or I take on their problems and I try to help them. And that's especially true in religious liberty cases because you're often representing people or entities that are vulnerable in some way, right? Because of their beliefs, they are being targeted or they're being discriminated against or mistreated. And so it's a special opportunity. And it's true of all pro bono work in some sense, but it's especially true for people who are religious to be able to give that service to others. I would say that it's a little harder in private practice to devote a lot of your time to it. That's just the nature of the job. And so it's really important that you find the time to carve out those opportunities and that time, because as an associate, you're going to be feeling pressure to bill a lot of billable time. That's sort of how you're predominantly evaluated. The nice thing is at most law firms, this is true at Dechert, we give credit for pro bono hours on par with paid hours, and so up to a certain quite generous amount we do that. And so it is, as an associate, that pressure is weakened a little bit. As a partner, I don't really get pro bono credit for my hours, but I still do probably somewhere between 150 and 250 hours a year, just because it's something that I find valuable. I think it's important. And I also know that a number of associates that I work with find it valuable and important. And it's something that when your daily bread is discovery disputes and Westlaw in financial cases, it's nice to once in a while do something that you find really enriching. So I would encourage those of you who go to law firms, I'm guessing it's probably going to be a lot of you, at least for a period of time, to really sort of fight to carve out that time. And so, that kind of leads to the question of how do you do it, right? How do you choose a law firm? If that's what you want to do, what do you do when you get there? I would say, maybe with the exception of Jones Day, which has, a history and sort of a reputation of doing a lot of this work as an entity, the truth is, law firms are just collections of people, right? They're partnerships of individuals who build the business collectively. And so I think looking for places where you see individuals who are doing that sort of work, right? So I often will have summer associates like Riley Compton come to me and say, hey, I'm interested in this kind of work. I see that you've done it, and can I help with it? So that's the first thing, is trying to find places where there are people who are doing this kind of work. And then once you're there, to do essentially what I just said, which is seek out the people that are doing it, find mentors. That's important just as a general rule in life and in the legal profession, to find people that you can confide in, that you can ask questions to and not feel awkward or embarrassed to do so, that will have your best interests at heart and that will look out for you. So, that's the other, the key way of doing it. And then, the last point that I'll make, and then I'll sort of yield back because I'm guessing that, probably more of my value is in answering questions and giving you a spiel about being a law firm lawyer, is I'm going to emphasize something Jennie said, which is that your friendships and your classmates and the people that you've worked with throughout your career, you will be shocked at how many times those relationships keep coming up in ways that you have no expectation, right? It might be somebody who calls you and says, hey, here's a case. Remember, when we were in law school together, I knew that you were interested in religious liberty, and I have a friend who just had this terrible thing happen to him, and I, was hoping you could help them. Or just somebody, I think 7 of the jobs that Jennie turned down, I maybe called her about, 4 or 5 of them. And so, you will have these instances where people will come back into your life, or they'll continue to be colleagues. And so just making sure that you cultivate those relationships, that you keep up those friendships, and that you say yes to opportunities that might seem like risks, but they are calculated risks, and to have the courage, particularly, religious liberty work is still considered, fine within law firms. Certain types of cases are less tolerable to big law firms, which is partly client-driven, to be honest. But having the courage to take on cases, even if you think there might be some people who look at you a little bit differently and say, oh, you're the person who took on, this case that I don't really agree with, because I don't think that some public policy should yield to religious liberty in some instance. But having the moral fortitude to do that is really important as well. And a big part of that is building up the credibility, right? So that, the firm says, we value this person, they're a hard worker, they do their work in all the other cases, and we're going to let them take on this project that might bring some notoriety to the firm that, some people might not like. So having both the courage and building up that credibility is very important. So on that note, I'll yield and send it over to Brendan, who, will talk about the transactional side. I'm a litigator, I should have said at the beginning, so I'm mostly involved in disputes.
Thank you. And I promise I'll be brief, because I think a lot of the topics I was hoping to talk about have already been covered very ably here. That was the hopeful side of big law. I'm now going to crush all of your dreams and share a little bit about my background. I am on the transactional side. I'm a partner at Faegre, Dechert, Biddle, and Reath, LLP, the greatest named law firm in America. And we have a very large nonprofit practice, which is somewhat unusual in big law. There are probably 5 or 6 firms that have very sizable nonprofit practices. I'm lucky enough to be in ours. So we represent a lot of religious organizations, churches, grant makers, et cetera, and then a lot of ancillary groups. And that's actually one of the ways to get into big law and do religious work, is to find the industries that interest you that also have big religious organizations. So churches is certainly one area. Religious schools like colleges and universities, that most big law firms have some university or college practice, and hospitals and universities. Those are sort of the obvious ones where you can kind of come in the side door, and if you're interested in working with religious organizations, that's a great way to do it. So the way I got into big law is that I was very briefly in the seminary here with Holy Cross, and when I got out, it was just when the abuse crisis was happening, or the litigation around it was happening. And I went and worked at Aiken Gump. And at the time, Aiken Gump, which is also a great name, by the way, my brother refers to his prostate as his Aiken Gump. But anyways, it was a great experience despite the name. So the Aiken Gump had this practice representing Catholic religious orders, and a lot of these Catholic religious orders were in a lot of litigation because of all the abuse claims. And what they realized was that they weren't very well structured in sort of modern corporate structures. So they hired Aiken Gump both to defend them in litigation, which mostly meant setting up trusts and paying out settlements, and then restructuring them from a corporate law standpoint. And that was fascinating to me. We did property law, human resources. We worked with cemeteries, because a lot of these religious orders had their own cemeteries. A lot of them had universities that they sponsored, like this one. A lot of them had hospitals, et cetera. So I got to touch all of these different areas of law at big law. And that's one of the advantages of being there in a big firm. And I got to work with all these experts who were subject matter experts in all those areas. But we were sort of overseeing these big restructurings for religious organizations. So that was how I got involved. And then from that, as all the other panelists have mentioned, it's just the relationships. You start to know in-house counsel here and there. You know people at the trade associations that are serving these religious orders. You get on the boards of different groups and meet people. And then they know you're in this space and more work comes your way. I don't do religious organizations work full time. It's probably 20% of my practice. But at a big law firm, that's actually quite sizable, especially on the transactional side. So it's been a privilege for me to do that. One of the things, so that's the hopeful part too. There is an opportunity in big law. I wanted to just offer a few reflections, though, on some of the things that I didn't know when I started working for religious orders. I had been a member of a religious order briefly, and so when I entered the law firm thinking, oh, I'll do this religious order work, it'll be great, it'll be with people I love, and they sort of speak the language I've been enculturated in lately. What I found is a lot of them had abusive priests that they had been hiding for decades, and it pissed me off, really. And I say that, I don't usually use language like that, but it's true. And I didn't realize how much I cared. And normally people ignore everything I say, including my clients, right? So you give advice and they do something else, and that's perfectly fine. It doesn't bother me at all. Our job is just to advise them on their options in the law. But I found that I cared very much when religious institutes kept doing things that I thought were wrong. And I just wanted to mention that because I think some people think that every religious organization is angelic. And they're not. Many of them are hiding misdeeds by their people they were responsible for, or they've become institutionalized in the sense that the people advising them are all more interested in protecting the institution than they are about justice, even for victims of abuse sometimes. And so I just wanted to mention, if you do this work, you got to guard your heart a little bit, because it can really affect you in ways that working for any other type of client doesn't affect. I think doesn't affect most people, and it's more transactional. At least for me, it was very much a thing for my heart, and it was very hard. I struggled with questions about my commitment to the institutional church when I started doing this work. And one of the comments earlier, I don't know who made it, was about having a mentor. And that's super helpful. So every job I've ever taken in law firm life, I've found somebody during either the recruitment process or the interview process who I trusted, and who I knew I could sort of discern my way through legal practice with. And I would encourage you, if you're in the job search, sometimes you have to take jobs blind and you like the work. But if you can find somebody that you trust along the way, it's super helpful, especially when you're doing religious work, because there's a temptation and a pressure for you to advise religious organizations to protect themselves instead of having as their lodestar Jesus Christ and his mission on earth. Or if you're of another faith, whatever that particular thing is in your faith tradition that should be guiding this towards justice. And having somebody there who can say, you're right to push back here, it's okay, is really valuable. And so I wanted to mention one other thing around this, is that I think your human formation is as important as your legal formation. So going to a great school like Notre Dame was a great choice. I think you get a great legal training here, but it's also a great choice because this is a place where they take human formation seriously. And I hope you'll devote as much time to that as you will to your legal practice. Jennie mentioned it in terms of family life. I think that's obviously important. You have to have your priorities straight on that, because law firm, especially big law, pressure is to basically be married to the firm instead of your spouse, and to know how to resist that is really important, and to have people who support you resisting that as well, and carving out some space where you're not just billing hours all the time. But also human formation in terms of being able to say no to clients when they want you to say yes, and to being willing to have moral conversations with them and not just give them legal advice. This is especially true in religious organizations. They're often open to having a moral perspective when they're seeking legal advice. And being willing to do that and feeling comfortable that you have been praying hard and you've been studying hard, and you're in a position where you know where your own limits are, where you won't go beyond them in terms of what's morally appropriate in things, is really important if you're going to be, I think, an effective religious lawyer representing religious organizations. And with that comes one last point, and it's the willingness to quit. And I think if you start every job with the willingness to quit the job, it's important, because then you're free. And if you're there just for a paycheck, or you're there, there are lots of reasons to be at jobs, and we have families and other commitments and so forth. But there are times when it may be appropriate for you to say, you can do that, but I'm not going there with you. Let me help you find another lawyer. And to have the moral freedom to be able to do that, I think, is an essential characteristic of this type of work. So that's the warning part about this kind of work, but hopefully that's helpful. But I would say this is a great area of law. I think it's it's the area of law that's most like being a country lawyer, where you get to do everything. And I think Jennie was mentioning that in in-house positions, they advise on every issue under the sun. In law firm life, too, you often have colleagues who are the experts, but you get to see this huge area of law, which is really fun. And if you're entrepreneurial, and that's your attitude, that you'll take the work that lands on your desk, then all this area will just open up for you wherever you are, whether it's in-house, in big law, or in a more focused firm that does this especially. So anyways, those are my comments on this. But thank you all for coming. I think it's great to see so many people here at this event.
think we have time for a couple questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much, guys. That was awesome. So all of you touched on the idea of vocation, structuring things, and then also being in a big law firm, and then from there on, kind of structuring that to be able to do things that are very meaningful. Did any of you guys experience that idea guiding you when you were thinking about, I guess, A, regions where you practiced, B, like specific firms that you went to? A lot of you guys mentioned how, Jones Day does a lot more religious liberty type stuff. And then also specific practice groups that you were in at firms, unrelated to the pro bono stuff. Did you guys find that the sort of stuff that you wanted to do guided what you were doing in the non-pro bono side of things? Or did you find that it was more of a discernment absent that, and then you kind of plugged it in after you were there, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, I'm happy to handle it. For me, it was probably a mix. Like anything in life, things just happen, right? And you kind of, all of a sudden you're standing there and somebody asks you to write a brief in a really consequential case. But I do think, being mindful, I think that's something that all of us have sort of said in various ways, that like being intentional and knowing what you want out of your life or out of your career is really important, because while you might not be able to magically make some amazing opportunity appear out of thin air, you put yourself in positions to have those things come to you, and you put yourself in a position to say yes to things when they do come your way, if that makes sense. So I do think, if there are certain things that you want to do, one thing that I personally have always done is look for people in the profession who seemingly have done those things and seemingly are happy and have balance in their life. And so, I've been blessed to have a number of mentors, including Paul Clement, who I think is a great example where, I think I can say this, he has a family that he loves, and that he has, a spouse that he seems to have a very good relationship with, but he's obviously at the top of the profession. So I think it's important to find people like that show that you can observe. They may not give you advice that's like, here is how I did it, but you can observe how they structure their life and the things that they've done as a way to model.
I was just going to mention, I was just going to mention, I don't think most people come out of law school and hit their dream job right away. It's going to take a decade or two, probably. Some people get there faster than others. But I think if you take each job, looking at it sort of as a ladder, or you're building a structure, and the next step makes sense in the structure that you're building, even if it's not perfect, if it has an opportunity, even if it's on the pro bono side, but you can see that, and there's an opportunity to do that kind of work. It may not be your full plate of work, but it makes sense, and you start to develop the skills that you'd like to have as a lawyer. That's very, I think, helpful, because some people, I think, want to get their dream job right away. And I think if you're comfortable getting a good job, that'll teach you the skills, and you can translate that into more opportunities in the areas you want. That'll serve you well, and maybe cut down on some of the anxiety about not having the best opportunity right away.
Anyone else? We have time for a few more. Okay.
I'm interested in going into general counsel work, and am similarly positioned to go to a firm this summer, and might continue to do that after graduation. Do you have any recommendation for choosing the litigation side versus the transactional side, or particular practice groups that would be beneficial for a general counsel job down the road?
That's a great question. So my background was really unsuitable, frankly, for becoming, for going in-house, because again, I had been an appellate lawyer primarily, right, which is just not particularly useful when you're in-house. It worked out fine for me, and I had received really excellent legal training in terms of like my analytical and communication skills, but if you're thinking in terms of specific practice areas, employment is the first one that comes to mind, right? It's a very large portion of the legal problems that come up at any institution have to do with managing your workforce, right? So if you come in with even a little bit of familiarity with employment law, that's super helpful. Transactional side is really important too. I didn't have any of those skills, but again, every institution reviews a ton of contracts, right? It's just sort of part of the bread and butter of what you do in-house. I have twice now, at both of the places where I've been in-house, participated in an overhaul of the entire contract review process, right? So if you have a little bit of familiarity with reviewing contracts, even if it's litigating over what contracts mean, you have a sense of how important certain terms are and that kind of thing, is super helpful as well. Anything tax related, what are some of the other ones you mentioned, which I thought were good. Property, there's a lot of property management. So you can really come at it from a number of different areas. And again, it's sort of communication skills and analytical skills and how to write clearly and concisely for non-lawyers. Even how to structure emails in a way that sort of gets your point across quickly and clearly and doesn't require people to get down in the legal weeds. Those are all skills that you can develop really in any practice at a law firm that are making super valuable in-house.
Genevieve, did you have any thoughts on a similar transition from a firm to the government, things that you've seen that would be useful to build up at a firm if you're looking to go to the federal government or something?
One thing is that, as we talked about opportunities finding you, if you go somewhere busy, you're just going to have opportunities to jump on all kinds of things, right? But one thing to look out for that's sort of that I think speaks to this on the government side, like DOJ is the law firm. What happens with government hiring is often there's some huge need, either because the case law shifts and then there's all these question marks that have to get filled in and there's a new litigation or some new agencies built and now that's getting sued. But by the time the government gets around to posting the position, the fire is out sometimes. So what tends to be the places that are easy to get in are the places that are either on fire or just the fire's just been put out, kind of. So keep an eye out for that. You may not want to go to certain fires, but sort of the more that's burning, the more opportunities there are. And the more choice you have over your opportunities. And then you can just build up a ton of experience quickly, you know. So that's just different. It's kind of the government's take on that.
We brought up time for one more. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you for being here today. Obviously, everybody here is like passionate about this work, but if I have different interests, right, or my practice area might not focus on religious liberty someday, how do you recommend staying involved or being involved as a young lawyer at a big firm, you know, in a big city where there might not be as passionate people in general about this?
Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, Mike.
All right. It's hard. I mean, I think it's a really good question because it's not easy. You know, and I lived in Washington for almost 10 years. It's a lot easier there, right? Because it's a place that attracts people that have that sort of public service mentality. Even if they're at a private law firm, there's still a lot of people that they're attracted to that area because of that. I think, you know, finding groups that you can be a part of, and you know, for me moving to Philadelphia, one thing that's been a really great blessing is I have friends that aren't just lawyers now, right? When I was in Washington, virtually all my friends were lawyers, and now I have friends who are doctors and contractors and accountants, and you're gonna, you know, they may ask you questions about the religious liberty aspects of the law, and you may gain from them insights into, you know, a doctor who has to face certain moral and spiritual questions in his or her practice, and there is a richness that comes out of that that's not as monolithic as when you're in law school or a lawyer in Washington. So, you know, to the extent your question is getting at that, a lot of you folks would be in, you know, all sorts of places around the world. Just being intentional and trying to find those groups. You know, my wife actually says this to me all the time that I don't value the need for friendship as much as I should, and I think it's a natural tendency of lawyers, you know, in a big law firm that, you know, you measure your day by what you build your time to, but it's really important not to succumb to that because friendship is really important. You know, the fellowship that you gain when you know, even if you're not doing this kind of work, as you said, finding people that share that passion for it is really important.
Great. Before we break, I'm going to offer one last thought. Some of you might be thinking, how do I start? Is there something I do now in law school? Start forging relationships and open up these doors, these opportunities that maybe will come along. I'll just give a plug for a few things. One, take Brendan's class. I think you probably can't do anything better than law school than take Brendan's class to sort of immerse yourself in this world and start to meet people who matter. You know, apply to work in a religious liberty clinic. Obviously, it's self-serving, but I think that'll give you great exposure. to this type of work. But then look around the law school, seek out mentors like you've heard, but look for opportunities with the program on Church, State, and Society and Stephen and Rick Garnett. And they have fellowships, for example, available in the summer to help give you stipends to pursue work like this where you might not get paid otherwise and maybe need a paying job in the summer. There are opportunities like that. I know Brendan's connected with some other fellowships that our students have gotten. So just look around and don't think that, oh, I don't know, I guess I can't do anything until I'm a lawyer, until I'm 5 years down the road. You can start now. And so anyway, please join me in thanking our panelists.